So the next thing we're talking about is not necessarily when the Exodus took place, but who was the Pharaoh? This, of course, is another big hot button topic and issue. And I know that there are lots of different opinions on this. But again, when we look at the biblical chronology the Bible gives us, we begin to dive into the Egyptian chronology and the history that we find there. And so to help answer that question, we look to a Pharaoh that I really think would be the Pharaoh of the Exodus, and that is Amenhotep II. Now, this has to do a lot with what we call the Egyptian high chronology, which tends to be kind of more traditional chronology. And so it kind of gives him to be the Pharaoh that took reign over Egypt shortly before the Exodus, shortly before 1446. And he's the new Pharaoh that would be on the throne. This would basically be his father, Thutmose III, being the Pharaoh that had died just before Moses comes back from Midian. There's a new kid on the block, a new Pharaoh, Amenhotep II being that Pharaoh of the Exodus. And so when we look at his life, there's actually some very interesting things about the life of Amenhotep II and some of the reasons why we pinpoint him as that Pharaoh of the Exodus. According to Josephus, he told us that the Pharaoh of the Exodus had only recently received the government. And so we look at the time frame, this would be that Pharaoh, we believe, because his father, Thutmose III, had only recently died. But if you read in Scripture, it seems to indicate that the Pharaoh that Moses fled from when he goes to Midian is the same Pharaoh that dies just before he comes back from Midian. And so because of that, we would see that we've got the Pharaoh of the Exodus being the same Pharaoh who was there for 40 years while Moses was in Midian. He dies, and then Moses comes back into Egypt at that point. And so that's what we're looking at here. The only Pharaoh that fits the bill, the only Pharaoh that lived that long during that time frame could have been Thutmose III. He's the only Pharaoh who lived for that length of time. 54 years he died. So, interestingly, we see that. Second thing we see is the Bible tells us regarding the 10th plague of Egypt that every firstborn son in Egypt will die. Now, if God was really being very strictly literal about that, if the king of Egypt at that point, if the Pharaoh himself was also a firstborn, he should have died, if you're being strictly literal. But he wasn't. He was actually not the firstborn son. He had an elder brother who would have died before him at some point. He was actually a second-born son in that family. And then interestingly, we also see that Amenhotep was raised in Lower Egypt, where the biblical land of Goshen is at. Not necessarily way down south in the land of Luxor and Thebes, but down in the same place where the Hebrew Israelites were actually living at. So because of this, we see that most of the other pharaohs were living far to the south. This pharaoh fits the bill. And when we look here, this land, this is the biblical land of Goshen. This is a beautiful land. A picture I took when I was out there. This is a lush land, and this was where he was raised, right next to the Hebrew Israelites, which is the only thing that makes sense when Moses goes back and forth to the Pharaoh to have an audience. In fact, Pharaoh calls him in the middle of the night during that 10th plague, and Moses goes there during that same night. They couldn't have lived hundreds of miles away. They had to live close together. When we look at other interesting, curious events of the life of Amenhotep II, we see that his successor, his son that took the throne next, was also not a firstborn son. His older brother died, perhaps it seems like when he was young. So the question is, did he die as the eldest son during the 10th plague? Second thing is, right after this, we see a major power decline. So Thutmose III is known as the Napoleon of Egypt. He was the father of the Pharaoh of the Exodus. But then when Amenhotep comes onto the scene, now all of a sudden there's a dramatic decrease in political power and might in campaigns. He seems to be very weakened. He didn't do nearly as many campaigns as his father did. And so the question is, did the loss of those 600 horsemen and chariots in the Red Sea have an impact? Did the 10 plagues of Egypt cripple Egypt for a time? We also see that there was a dramatic change in foreign policy. They were now actually at this point seeking aid from other nations, other countries, trying to make alliances. Well, if you are the powerful nation on the planet, if you are like in Thutmose's day, if you are the Napoleon of Egypt like we talked about, you don't have to beg for help with other people. You basically tell them what to do. Suddenly now we see that Amenhotep II, he's now begging for treaties and alliances, and he seems to be quite weakened. Again, was he no longer able to dominate the field with power? Another interesting thing, we see that people looking at his campaigns, some have attributed one of those campaigns to around November of 1446. Now that 1446 is the same year of the Exodus, we believe, and during this time he goes on a campaign in November, which is quite unusual because this is the rainy season. This is not when kings go off on campaigns and go to war. In fact, what does the Bible tell us? It tells us it was in the spring when kings go to war. But he goes back, it seems, in the same year of the Exodus later on, and he goes back, and so he brings back a tremendous amount of slaves back into Egypt. The question is, was he looking for a replacement workforce for the Hebrews who had just fled? Of his campaigns, he goes on another one shortly after that, and he claims to have brought back over 101,000 Asiatic slaves. And this is the people that live in the land of Canaan. This is what the Hebrew people would have been. This is what other people that would have been related to the Hebrews would have been, known as Asiatics. He claims to have brought back over 100,000 slaves, and he makes special note of about 36 of those who were the Habiru. And Habiru is a very similar word to Hebrew. In fact, many people believe that word Habiru to be the same word that they would use for Hebrew. So he goes back with a huge slave force he brings back. Now that only makes sense if you're trying to replace a slave population that you had just lost. And so we see this amazing thing in the life of Amenhotep II, which is why in many ways we believe that Amenhotep II is in fact this Pharaoh of the Exodus.